Hi everybody, back again for our final session of our annual labour market conference, and our final session is looking at and is on the theme of after COVID. The session just has two papers. The first paper is from Miss Sayamsiddha, who's an MA student in Development and Labour Studies in the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And our second speaker then is co-director of the NERI, Dr. Tom McDonnell. Both speakers are going to have in around 15 minutes to speak. In around 10 minutes to speak, allowing us that little bit of time for questions after each presentation. Miss Sayamsiddha is having some issues with her video, so you'll only be able to see her slides. You'll not be able to see her. Again, if you have any questions on the presentations, post them through the Q&A box and I'll present them to the speakers after each of the sessions. I'm going to continue for now and hand over to Ms. Sayamsiddha to start her presentation. Thanks very much.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So the topic.
I think we're having some difficulties hearing.
Ms. Sayamsiddha, do we have you on the line still?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'll put back up your slides again and we can continue. Okay?
All right. Hello. So the title of the paper that I'm eager to share with everyone here is Imagining the Post-COVID Informal Economy in India, a Case for Demand-Based Urban Job Guarantee Program. Next slide, please. So basically, as India subsists through the global pandemic, we are currently experiencing the highest number of cases in a day. On 24th of March, the government of India announced a nationwide lockdown with a 4-hour notice. It was basically a policy response to curb the spread of the virus. So with that national lockdown, the health crisis then turned into an economic and humanitarian crisis as there was a massive uncertainty. Immediately, people lost their livelihood. The people who are daily wage workers were unsure as to how they would earn their next bread. Starvation, poverty, inequality, workers were forced out of the cities that they helped build, and this impacted mostly the workers of the informal sector, which is about 90% of the workers with little to no social security. Next slide. This paper basically tries to analyze, previous slide please. This paper basically tries to analyze the impact of the pandemic on the informal economy and the policy discourse that followed. In this regard, it tries to understand the impact of right-based NERI, which is National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and which basically offers a demand-based job guarantee program for the rural population in India. We are going to assess its role in addressing the issue of unemployment in rural areas following the return of the workers and discuss its prospects. It further tries to explore the scope of the demand-based job guarantee program. Next slide. Prior to the crisis induced by the COVID-19, the Indian informal economy, the Indian economy basically was already going through a situation of crisis where the GDP continued to fall since 2015-16. We were experiencing highest open unemployment rate, consumption expenditure was at its lowest, and we survived two shocks in terms of demonetization and introduction of goods and service tax in 2017. Next, please. So basically what we can understand here is that the impacts were not created but rather accentuated by the pandemics. These impacts were basically the mass layoffs, unemployment, loss of livelihood, and increasing inequality. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy shows that in the month of April and May, following the nationwide lockdown, which was announced in the end of March, the rate of unemployment stood at 23%, which is threefold more the figure from the same period in the previous year. Next. This resulted in a this entire nationwide lockdown, and the uncertainty resulted in reverse migration, where people who were in the urban areas, who came as migrant workers in the urban areas, were left with no choice but to go back to the rural areas, where they may have some land, but more than that, they have that kinship which they don't have in the urban areas. So once they were forced due to their loss of livelihoods, people started walking on their foot. They took this long journeys, carrying all that they possessed in the urban areas, carrying their old parents, their children, and the situation was very grave, and it continues to be very concerning. But what it also did, this entire process, was to create this alteration in the labor market dynamics. So the places which were earlier experiencing a net negative migration were now experiencing labor surplus. These changes impacted the workers and the economy as a whole, which is experiencing both an unprecedented collapse in demand and disruption in supply chains. Next. So as institutional response and policy discourse on 26th March, almost as an afterthought, the finance minister announced a relief package, which was mostly meant for direct cash transfers, an analysis of which shows that the package was mostly already budgeted. On 12th May, the Prime Minister announced another economic package of worth of 20 trillion, described as a move towards self-reliant India. Critics have, however, pointed out that the package continues to fall short, as it includes fiscal and monetary policy, which were already announced previously. Next, please. So what we can, the key points to take away are limited relief and recovery due to exclusion and limited allocation of resources. Also the emphasis on targeted transfers in terms of food grains, cooking gas, etc., etc. But the unique investment came in terms of in NEREGA, which is the welfare program for addressing unemployment in the rural areas. There we saw a 60% allocation, which was over the budgeted amount. Next, please. So what is this NEREGA that we're talking about? The world's largest job guarantee program that guarantees rural households 100 days of work. It is implemented by the local government bodies. It is divided between unskilled and semi-skilled and skilled laborers, and it is hailed for this contribution, strengthening participatory democracy, caste and gender upliftment, increase in incomes, asset creation, etc. But it is also criticized for issues related to leakages, delayed payments, inadequate funds, etc. Next, please. So during this pandemic, actually following the pandemic, due to the reverse migration, although regardless of the criticism, it was almost as a fallback for the workers who were coming back to the rural areas. And due to all of this, the program saw a huge increase in demand. CIME data highlights that the unemployment rates in rural India now has dropped back to the rates during the pre-COVID times, due to coincidental timing with seasonal farming activities, and also due to government policies related to job creation. This renewed the debate over urban job guarantee programs. Next slide, please. So in this time, NEREGA was able to increase the average income per person per month, almost doubled it to 1,000 rupees which is in the first 4 months of fiscal 21. In terms of person days, the period between April to July, there is a 25% greater execution of work under NEREGA, thereby aiding the rural economy. The bigger states which otherwise experiences a huge out migration were states where work allocation increased more than 50% on year in the first 4 months. Next slide, please. So, looking at the impact, there have been several suggestions in reducing the impact of NEREGA in rural areas, one of which is reorienting the jobs to create micro enterprises and contribute to infrastructural development of the augmenting health and sanitation sector. Another is large-scale opening of work sites and the opportunity to enroll at site, expanding the permissible work list and timely payments, preferably in cash, increasing the number of days under the program from 100 to 150 days. Many people have also suggested to increase it to 200 days all throughout the year, so people who are not not able to find work, or at least able to have the unemployment allowances through the program. Next, please. Um, there have been several suggestions and proposals to extend NEREGA to urban centers as well, while imagining the post-COVID informal economy and the way forward. In this regard, various state-level job guarantee programs following the pandemic have started in a positive step in the way forward, because they will be able to give us experience that is needed to understand in what ways do we need to reimagine when we do so in the urban circumstances, because of the heterogeneity that exists among the different urban sectors as well. Considering the magnitude of the crisis, it is crucial that a national policy be developed in order to combat the risk of long-term unemployment, greater poverty, and inequality. Next slide, please. So in this regard, there are two proposals that we're going to discuss here. First is a proposal by the Azim Premji University, which proposes a urban version of NEREGA, which is sought to not only ensure legal right to work for urban workers, but also initiate infrastructural development. It aims at strengthening small and medium cities, create work, and also create sustainable cities for improving the quality of urban infrastructure and services by restoring urban commons and ecology. It emphasizes on a bottom-up approach and which empowers the urban local bodies by increasing financial and human capacities. It also emphasizes on democratic decentralization, where ULBs shall be responsible for administering the program and for timely dispersal. They also um, suggest ways of transparency and grievance redressal. Next, please. The alternative suggestion comes from George Reyes, a development economist, who suggests a decentralized urban development and training scheme. The proposed idea is to release job stamps which the worker can take to public institutions which are approved by the government. These job stamps can then be converted to 1% day of work, with specialized within a specified period with an approved institution finding work and the government paying wages. The employees will be chosen from a pool of registered workers by the approved employer or through an independent agency, a third party, in order to avoid collusion in placement. It suggests ways to maintain transparency. Another crucial component of it is the training aspect, where he suggests that when a skilled worker is hired, an unskilled worker should be mandatorily hired in order to generate skill formation, basically. Next, please. So in conclusion, from this discussion, we need to understand that we cannot limit our analysis of the two proposals in isolation of each other or any such proposals. We can actually think of a program which is a synthesis of the two. The first can be emphasized in small and medium cities, which are close to the rural areas, and we already have the experiences in the rural areas for over a decade, so it will be much easier to design such a program. But the second can be explored in the context of major cities with a huge population of daily wage workers who may benefit the most from such a scheme, because they do not have access to social security mechanisms and or decent wages. So such a program can ensure that they are paid well and they have access to social security benefits. Moreover, the heterogeneity of socioeconomic factors around the populace needs to be considered at all times. Mechanisms to address these differences among urban areas is something which needs to be explored further. Next slide, please. We see through this discussion how the pandemic brought invisible migrants to the center of the policy discourse. The impact of NEREGA has been significantly positive and has also refreshed, more importantly, the debate upon extension of such a program to the urban areas. Although there are 7 potential ways the program can be made more efficient in the rural sector, the potential of such a program in the urban alternative is immense. Along with creating jobs, such an initiative can also create aggregate demands which can push the economy towards a path of recovery. Next is the references, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Miss Sayamsiddha. Very interesting, and particularly for myself, obviously based in the Belfast office, to hear the experiences going through COVID from India essentially is really interesting and provides a kind of unique perspective as to how different countries are really dealing with this differently. We've got a question in about though the India being a federal, and the question relates to whether or not there's a differential picture between states in terms of the supports and the effects of these supports across different states.
Hello, Dr. Wilson. Can you repeat your question, please?
Yeah. So the question relates to what India being a federal, and the question is whether or not we are seeing a differential picture in terms of the supports which are being provided across different states.
Oh, yes, yes, definitely. So during this pandemic, different states responded differently. A lot of the states within India were able to provide job guarantee programs, and they were able to give they were able to provide targeted transfers to a greater population. For example, the Indian state of Kerala already had a job guarantee program at place for the past decade, which is an urban job guarantee program, as opposed to the rural job guarantee program, which exists across the country. So they were able to, because they had the existing infrastructure, so they were able to give the immediate relief that was required. Several other states are now planning and envisioning an urban job guarantee program. So different states have, to a very large extent, responded to the pandemic quite differently.
Very good. And a second question relates to some of your earlier slides showing that dependent on skill level, the level of financial support was differential. So those unskilled workers with skills were getting 40%, whereas unskilled workers 60%. Can you speak a little bit about the differential support dependent on skills level?
No, it's how much job is offered. So basically, 60% of the job is offered to unskilled workers, and there are also provisions for like 1/3 of the jobs are offered to women. So it also ensures that there is gender upliftment, and also certain section of the jobs are also like they ensure that people who are from the marginalized communities have access to all these jobs. So it's basically to ensure that everybody, the people who are most vulnerable, have access to resources.
And just generally, how successful have the current supports been?
How successful has been?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, pardon me. I didn't.
How successful have those supports been, do you think, in terms of protecting the most vulnerable?
So far, obviously, the thing is, all the support that came almost as an afterthought. So the announcements of relief packages and targeted transfers or whatever it is came much later, and all of, like, most of the announcements or the relief packages which came were already budgeted. So there hasn't been much which has been done for the extraordinary conditions. So I think there is room for a lot, or there is a lot of room for for thinking how to ensure that the people who are the most vulnerable have access to the resources that they need, especially in times of pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, I'm going to have to end it there. I must say, I'm saying it just because we're stuck for time. Keep an eye on the Q&A box, because some people send in their questions afterwards, so there might be specific questions for you. So keep an eye and you might respond to them yourself. I'm going to move on. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to our last speaker of today and the last speaker of our conference. And we have Dr. Tom McDonnell, co-director of us here at the Nevin Institute, or the Nevin Economic Research Institute. And Tom is going to look at, consider the issue of COVID and beyond, and he's going to look at where do we go from here, what are the principles that we should have for the 2020s economy. And I'll move it over to you, Tom, again, about 15 minutes. Any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll pose them to Tom after his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. So it's you've done a great job so far. A long day, I know. So where do we go from here? What are some of the principles that should guide us over the next few years? Obviously, we're currently enduring an unprecedented economic crisis. The Western European economies are suffering their deepest recession since the Second World War. Something like 90% of countries will face a recession this year, which is unprecedented. Double-digit GDP losses in the second quarter for a number of countries, particularly severe in the United Kingdom, but certainly not just the United Kingdom. Employment rates have started to bounce back in the third quarter from, in the Republic of Ireland's case, a peak of close to 30%. Broadly speaking, central banks and governments have taken the correct economic approach. We've adopted, certainly Ireland and the UK have introduced wage subsidy and furlough schemes respectively. Short-time schemes have been adopted increasingly throughout Europe. And this has helped preserve productive capacity and labour market connectedness. While at the same time, income and liquidity supports have helped preserve demand. And one can really see in the statistics a massive increase in savings in the second quarter of the year. However, these policies will need to be maintained well into 2021. In Ireland and indeed the UK, I think it would be important to see the development of permanent short-time schemes, which can be taken off the shelf at time of crisis. It's important to avoid a cliff edge in relation to supports. This is particularly pertinent in the UK at the moment, with the possibility that the furlough scheme will be removed in October. We've seen a transformation of the relationship between market and state. So, for example, the Republic of Ireland is likely to face a once-off deficit this year of close to 30 billion, which would be enormous under normal circumstances. It is enormous even now, but it is necessary, it's justified, and it is also manageable given interest rates. And this has been really one of the important policy innovations at the euro area level over the last 10 years. There's been a learning from the great financial crisis, and now we have a lender of last resort in the form of the ECB supporting national governments. Without that in place, it wouldn't have been possible to maintain these levels of deficits, and the crisis would have been significantly deeper. But we're still, in some respects, in the early stages of the crisis. And if and when there are second lockdowns, governments will need to resume their role of liquidity and income source of last resort. We're seeing this at the moment in the Republic of Ireland. Dublin, which is the engine of the southern economy, is going to go into a deeper stage of lockdown. And this is going to continue and persist for months to come. And the supports, therefore, will also need to continue for months to come. And this is all within the context of a looming hard Brexit with no transition period, and with the possibility of no vaccine in the short term, and the need to live with the virus and to provide a just transition for affected sectors. So again, if we can kind of step back for a minute and identify what it is we're actually trying to achieve, it's not growth per se, it's sustainable and inclusive improvements in living standards. And we have been able to increase living standards consistently for most of society in material terms over the last 100 years. And most economists tend to attribute this to economic growth, and economic growth and development are considered synonymous. And growth is important for well-being, but there are major caveats there. Not all forms of growth are desirable. So, for example, a system that generates highly unequal growth won't necessarily benefit much of society. Environmentally damaging growth will entail costs for future generations. And there's other types of undesirable growth. We can easily think of the housing boom leading up to the great financial crisis in the Republic of Ireland. So again, defining our primary goal, sustainable and inclusive improvements in living standards, not growth per se. So if we look at sustainable productive capacity and how we develop that over time, and one of the real stylized facts from the last 25 years of economic history, particularly amongst advanced economies, is that there has been a steady erosion in the level of productivity growth year on year. And this has been a continuous process since at least the mid-1990s. We're far removed now from the high productivity of the 1945 to 1971 period. And much of the economic analysis that's out there is that this productivity growth year on year is going to decline further and further. And unfortunately, the COVID crisis is likely to compound this effect. And already we can see in a number of sectors there's a greater amount of work required to produce the same level of output. We're going to see higher levels of unemployment. That's going to lead to a deterioration of human capital, a winding down of machinery and equipment, and so forth. So if I can then kind of just return to this idea of productive capacity and distinguish between intensive growth and extensive growth. Intensive growth is based upon efficiency and productivity. Extensive growth is based upon using more resources. In the long run, the only opportunity available for us to continue to improve living standards is through intensive growth. Diffusion and application of new knowledge, artifacts, and ideas. And this concept of ideas as instructions for transforming economic inputs, labor and capital, into outputs. Unfortunately, there are certain characteristics of knowledge which generate market failure. There's systemic underproduction by the private sector, partially because they're not able to hold all of the gains for themselves, and therefore they have a disincentive to produce it in the first place. At the same time, there is an uncertainty associated with the production of knowledge goods. Your return may well be zero. And then, of course, there's institutional lock-ins. Certain institutions or governments may choose to constrain the development of new technologies and new opportunities, as we saw with China for much of the last half millennium leading up to the 20th century. So related to this concept of productive capacity is innovative capacity, and about the requirement for states, particularly advanced developed economies, to develop a proper innovation system. It's about the relationships between people. It's about levels of education and skill, networks, the cost of accessing knowledge, research and development spillovers, the quality of capital markets, and so forth. And really policy needs to move in a direction that supports this innovation system and enables it to drive innovations and improvements in productive capacity over time. Much of the evidence suggests that most of the gains for the majority of countries are through technology diffusion. And fundamental to this is communication, linkages, knowledge flows, collaboration. So we need a stronger higher level sector, and we need stronger linkages between the higher level education sector and indeed the private sector. And we need more resources on retraining, upskilling, reskilling, all of those things. And central to all of this is the role of the government as the key actor. It sets the rules of the game, it provides incentives, it makes direct interventions, and indeed it can counteract the structural market failures in the production of knowledge in the first place. Now, looking at the data for Ireland, North and South, at least UK data in the case of Northern Ireland, what we found is that there is a chronic underspend on per pupil education in the Republic of Ireland and in the United Kingdom, to the tune of 3 billion on a per pupil basis relative to other high-income Western European countries in the Republic of Ireland, and 16 billion, that's in euros, when it comes to the United Kingdom. Similarly, when it comes to public spending on a per capita basis on research and development, the Republic of Ireland was the second lowest, the United Kingdom was the lowest. And then again, when it comes to childcare supports, the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom stand out as the worst performers in Western Europe. So in all of these three dimensions, both countries do very, very poorly in terms of human capital development and maintaining that human capital within the workforce, which is why the childcare supports are so relevant here. Now, what we know from the literature is that it's skills for the population as a whole that matters, and not just for the top of the achievement distribution. So it's not simply about providing all the money into one or two elite universities and supporting, say, 10 or 20% of the population at the top. It's wider than that, and it's across the board. And there are certain types of associated or complementary investments that we can also make in terms of broadband infrastructure, research institutions, and so forth. And again, we can see here the very, very low level of full-time equivalent per pupil education spending, which in the case of the Republic of Ireland is particularly low at higher level, and in the case of the United Kingdom is particularly low at secondary level. We can see here per capita public R&D expenditure. Ireland and the UK essentially spend half on R&D of what peer countries in Europe spent. This is very obviously a false economy in the long run. Related to well-being, of course, is the issue of inequality, and this was covered in length in some of the earlier sessions today in particular, so I don't want to focus too much on it here. Just to make a couple of points, one is that we need to focus more on the labour share. Improving the labour share will improve distributional equity and reduce market inequality. There's a concentration of wealth within all economies, and what that means is that if capital income increases relative to labour income, that means the gains are going to a small segment of society. Wealth is much more concentrated than income. And in terms of reversing this process that we've seen since the 1980s of labour shares declining, one of the methods available in terms of doing that is about increasing the bargaining power of labour and indeed increasing wage floors. And unfortunately, what we've seen is a decline in trade union density in a hostile policy environment since the late 1970s, which has shifted power from labour to capital. Other things we can do: reform tax policy and social transfers, and then there's a very large debate about universal basic income versus universal basic services. Is there room for both? Is it better to decommodify essential goods and services, effectively reducing their costs to zero, or is it better to provide people with cash transfers? Then, in terms of sustainability, there's a number of dimensions through which we can look at this issue. One of them is, of course, the impossibility of maintaining the current model that we have in terms of carbon usage and GHG emissions, greenhouse gas, and the need to move towards a low carbon transition. But doing that will require buy-in from the population. So we have to look at the political economy considerations here. The clean transition may be politically unsustainable if it leaves behind groups and regions. So while, of course, there is a moral aspect to a just transition for regions and groups, there's also a very, very sound political argument for ensuring that there is a just transition so that we can proceed with the low carbon transition. Now, it just so happens that the COVID crisis may provide a spark to transition the economy because it creates an Overton window whereby more radical policies become available. So whether that be a greater focus on higher education, on education training, an acknowledgement of working from home and the importance of clean transportation options, a greater understanding of the need to engage in natural capital investment, whatever it might be. We now are at a transformative moment where it is possible to envisage new forms of taxation, new forms of public spending, new forms of support, and so forth. And then finally, my last points are that COVID will have a long-run scarring effect. Crisis will compound slowdown in productivity growth without policy intervention. However, the net benefits to investment, the literature suggests, again, are particularly high during recessions, and also where the cost of borrowing is low and when central bank interest rates are close to zero. All of this is in place. So there is a compelling case for investment-based stimulus to rebuild the economy now in the wake of the COVID-19 recession. So the focus, in my view, should be on a green transition with a complementary focus on education, R&D, and apprenticeships. So there's going to be a need for ongoing structural changes throughout the 2020s and a need for just transitions and a need for emergency supports to evolve over the next 12 to 18 months into new policy measures. Obviously, the structurally weaker economy will have implications for fiscal policy, and that brings up the question of how do we fund increases for education, higher level, but also apprenticeships, for childcare, for public R&D, multi-year innovation strategy. Well, we're going to need a new social dialogue. And we're going to need, following on from that, a root and branch review of our tax and social insurance system, and indeed regulatory policy, industrial policy, and indeed public spending policy. And that's not to downplay other sustainability issues that we're also going to need to focus on, such as long-run fiscal policy. Government revenue is going to have to significantly rise during the second quarter of the century, even if nothing else changes, simply because of deteriorating demographics from a fiscal point of view. Of course, obviously from a lifespan point of view, they're very, very positive. And also looking at Republic of Ireland in particular, the FDI-based industrial strategy, I'm thinking of the famous corporation tax strategy here in the Republic of Ireland, will come under immense pressure, and there will be a need to develop an enterprise policy for Indigenous firms. Looking at Northern Ireland and the UK, of course, there will need to be a consideration of economic policy in the context of being outside, and particularly for Great Britain, being outside the single market, and all the implications that follow from that. So I'm probably way over time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. No, Tom, you were just perfect in time. I was just about to come in and say, here's a warning, but no. Thanks very much. Got a few questions that I'll pose to you before I'll hand it back over to you just to close the conference very briefly. The first question relates to, and you touched on it there towards the end of your presentation in terms of tax. And the question is there a necessity to alter a revenue model in the longer term? And if so, when or where should this happen, or how?
Well, certainly when it comes to the Republic of Ireland, the answer to that is yes, and I would argue it's true for the United Kingdom as well. Both countries have revenue per person that is way out of line with every other country in Western Europe, and that makes it impossible to maintain or indeed sustain universal basic services. In terms of where, I would suggest that the social insurance system is what we have to look at there. If you look at taxes by themselves, we're not Republic of Ireland and the UK. Neither of them is a low tax country per se, but we are low revenue countries, and that means PRSI and national insurance are what you have to look at. And then unpacking that even further, you're looking at the employer contributions. As to when, certainly not at the height of a crisis. So you're probably looking at least 2 years down the line before you look at making significant increases in the revenue capacity of the state, other than fiddling at the edges stuff such as local property taxes and things like that. That will be the time. Now is the time for income supports, business supports. Next stage will be stimulus, and only after that should we move to increasing insurance.
Yes. The next question relates to your point that you made earlier on in your presentation about the trade-off, or you didn't present this as a trade-off, I don't remember the terminology, but this issue, I suppose, the trade-off in the literature and the discussion about universal basic income versus universal basic services. And I think the COVID crisis and what happened, or what might happen in terms of childcare provision, provides a lens through which to have this debate about should childcare be supported via income or via services. And I'd just like to hear some of your thoughts on that, perhaps, in terms of, where, childcare provision. Childcare obviously became a crucial and key, and still continues to be a key issue for many workers trying to continue with work, and the issues that presents. So any thoughts on that?
Well, my preference would be for childcare to be provided as a public service, where certainly the workers are paid for are basically state employees, or at least their salaries are paid for by the state. I think where Ireland, North and South, stand out relative to other countries is just the very, very low levels of public spending relative to other countries in Europe. And what we found is, what we found, particularly us, but what has been found is that there is a negative impact on labour force participation related to the cost of childcare. And even if incomes are increased, there will still be low levels of incomes in some households, and they won't necessarily make the choice to spend that on childcare. And we want childcare, in my view, is a merit good. We want people to avail of childcare services. We don't want to remove any human capital from the labour force. We know that it's almost always women who end up dropping out of the labour market for those reasons, and it's an enormous barrier for lone parents in particular, but ends up as being a de facto barrier for second earners. So in my view, absolutely, I would provide childcare as a public service.
Yeah, I was yesterday as well during Mary Murphy's presentation. Her opinion was that COVID has provided that has made it obvious basically that childcare is something that should be provided by government, because it provides, you know, the opportunity then for females to be able to participate in the labour market. I'm not entirely convinced that it has done that, because, you know, I think we're almost, you know, starting to move past and go, childcare is no longer an issue, despite you've got people screaming from everywhere going, I still can't go to work because I still do childcare or whatever. We've got another question, and it moves on to this issue of resilience, and it's related to, is there a need to build domestic capacity for environmental purposes or to secure supply chains and for pandemic style situations for key items such as PPE, whatever?
Well, of course, Ireland has tried the self-sufficiency route in the past, and the reality is that Ireland and indeed the United Kingdom are relatively small players relative to the size of the global economy. It isn't really practicable to provide everything yourself, and there's always going to be trade as a large component of that. The Republic of Ireland, as part of the single market, will be able to have access to almost everything it needs within that market. So no, I don't feel that the pandemic has shown that we need to be self-sufficient in everything. I think that Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland should be investing in green energy infrastructure anyway. And looking to ultimately export wind and wave energy outside the island. I think there's a good economic case for that, but it would be for different reasons rather than concerns about lack of supply arising from a pandemic, say. Yeah.
And I'm going to end it there, Tom, because of time, and it's obviously Friday afternoon and it's sunny outside, well, at least in Belfast. I think it's sunny right across the country today, so I think people will want to get off and start to enjoy their weekend, but that was really interesting. But I'm just going to hand it over to you now, Tom, just to close the conference formally.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to everyone who has presented, thanks to everyone who has attended and contributed. My thanks to UCD and the Geary Institute, and to Micheál in particular, who has helped enormously. I'd like to offer thanks to everyone within the NERI team who have been very, very professional. It's the first time we've done anything like this, and it's gone off, from what I can tell, without a hitch. And most of the credit for that has to go to my colleagues, Paul Goldrick-Kelly and Louisa O'Brien, who've put in an enormous amount of work. And I'd like to offer my thanks personally to them. And then finally, just to say that the NERI seminar series is returning. We'll be back in October, continuing on. They'll all be virtual for the foreseeable future, and the next one up will be for the Wednesday after budget. That's October the 21st, when we will have our post-budget analysis. And it will be something like this in terms of style. And then finally, the Donal Levin annual lecture, of course, will obviously be online again this year. And please look at our website for updates on that. And I'm sure you'll be getting updates from Louisa as well in your inbox. So with that, unless Paul, you want to make some final comments, I'm happy to sign off, and enjoy the weekend, everybody.
Yeah, just as a final piece of housekeeping, most of the slides, the vast majority of which, they'll be going up on our site shortly, as will videos of many of the sessions. So watch our social media, watch our site for those updates. And beyond that, I just reiterate what Tom said. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. This was a bit of an experiment, but I think a relatively successful one, considering. Thank you all very much. And I'll shut the conference.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye now.